not unlike the women she wrote about in a new history of women in journalism called Undaunted. She spent 11 years at UPI as a correspondent in Chicago, Brussels, London, and Tel Aviv. She moved to Newsday, where she served first as a UN correspondent and later as deputy Metro editor for New York Newsday. We all remember New York Newsday. From 1998 to 2020, she was a professor of journalism at NYU. And along the way, she wrote 6 books, the latest of which was as one of the best books, nonfiction books of the year by the Times. And she's going to be interviewed on stage by Mel Leitner, another veteran of UPI. For you younger folks, UPI is United Press International. He spent 20 years at UPI and at NBC News, reporting from Jerusalem and elsewhere in the Middle East. He's also the author of an acclaimed memoir, What They Didn't Burn, which chronicles his effort to track down his late father's Holocaust story by interviewing fellow survivors and digging deeply into the Nazi records. And it's in addition to a very emotionally moving book, it's also a great detective story. So come on up.
So Brooke and I go back more years than I'd like to recall. She was my boss when I was transferred to Tel Aviv, and we won't talk about that. Brooke.
We could talk about that.
No, I don't want to talk about that. Okay. So you did Nellie Bly. You did Fannie Hurst. Why did you do this book?
I was asked.
Okay.
One day in 2019, I got an email from someone I did not know except by name, who was a longtime editor at Knopf, John Siegel, saying, I would like to commission a book on the history of women in journalism. Would you like to discuss this? And it was just as I had announced that I was going to retire in 2 years. And so I thought, sure, I would like to discuss that. So that's how it came about.
Okay, but why was it important to do this book? Who was your audience?
Well, for me, the audience is the people in this room. I mean, that's, at UPI, we used to talk about the Kansas City milkman. You're always writing for someone. That's who was before my eyes, was people I knew who were older than I was or younger than I was, for whom this story would have special resonance. And I also knew that the story of women in journalism is not unlike the story of women in science, the women in philosophy, the women in medicine, the women in other fields. So I didn't think it would be delimited to a journalism audience because it has a universality that's pretty common to the women's history. It's just specific to journalism in this case.
I should point out, I checked this morning, and Brooke's book is in 836 libraries so far.
That's all?
Yeah. Well, your Nellie Bly book is in 1,400 libraries so far.
Exactly.
So, okay, it's early days yet. You broke up the book by epochs or periods of time.
Strict chronology. That was the order. John said that a commercial book, I don't know how commercial this book is, but a commercial book has to be chronological, that you have to help the reader. You cannot do themes, which I had also suggested. Themes is how the first book of this nature was written. It came out in 1936. It's called, you'll love this, Ladies of the Press. It was written by Ishbel Ross, who was one of the original front page girls of the 1920s, a really intrepid, fantastic New York reporter. When Stanley Walker wrote his city editor, his memoir of being this legendary editor of the Herald Trib, he included 10 reporters and their stories, like a story, like a seminal story of each of them. And Ishbel Ross is one to tell you how she was regarded. And interestingly, you can see they had the same problem we did, like, oh, pictures, you have to have pictures on the cover. So they didn't do it on the cover because in those days there weren't cover pictures too much, but they did them as end papers. And then it's organized by theme. Like, it's like, gee whiz, aren't women fabulous? It's like 700 pages long. So part one would be front page girl, stepping out, a scold, a siren, and a star. So she would, or geographical groups, or women's pages, or whatever. She was doing it all to say who were the women of journalism in 1936. In this case, that wasn't necessary to say because, of course, women had become prevalent, but doing it chronologically, which I hadn't realized because I had done a book on Nellie Bly, that came out in 1994, which I'm probably best known for, and then Fannie Hurst is a short story writer and novelist, but also was a magazine writer doing nonfiction as well. So I had a lot of time in the magazine universe from that work, and her life was endless. I mean, she is born in 1885 and dies in 1968, which is why I did a book about her. I was looking for women who the Times Obit Index gave a front page obit to. There were 6, in case you want to know. We could talk about who else. But anyway, that was why I picked her, because she represented the next era after Nellie Bly and what was happening in women's history. It was interesting to me to see why everything that had been figured out in 1890 had to be figured out again in 1970. I mean, I just couldn't understand. I'd already seen that people were dissecting if it made sense to work and hire babysitting help in 1890. Like, why were those questions anew, all those years later? So, I mean, the short answer is World War I, World War II, and the Depression in between, which sent women backwards. And she, Fannie Hurst was really a proto-feminist of the second wave because she was calling out this retreat of women. So I found her interesting. I don't think anybody else did, but I did. And then I did a book on undercover reporting that took the whole question of undercover reporting, the truth about deception. It's something I support, from 1820 to 2012 when I wrote that book. So, though this took 3 years, it really took 60 because I had done whole sections of this work. But I had never done it as a continuum, looking from 1840, when we first have mass journalism, to the present. And to be able to establish the patterns along the way, you could see how it's really a story of progress, setback, just like the civil rights movement. It has the same exact character. So that was fascinating to me. And then what forms that took and who mattered in their own time. I used, should I just go on? I'm just going. Okay.
No, go ahead. Just throw this away.
I used about 15 or 20 databases. Because of NYU, I have access to a lot of proprietary ones, which are extremely useful. And I just used 2 terms, women, journalism, in 10-year pockets, from 1840 to 1850, 1850 to 1860, et cetera, right to the present. So using those 2 words, women and journalism, not scientific, but it created consistency. It was a way to look at what was happening real time. Not the people we recovered and gotten excited about later, but who mattered in their own day. Who was important, who had, and remember, there's nothing wrong with journalists being forgotten. They're supposed to be forgotten. We do ephemeral work. It's meant to last today, tomorrow, for a week, for a month, maybe for a year. When it really does last, when people are talking about you 50 years later, I think that's something to pay attention to. And when in your own day, someone like Dorothy Thompson, who I'm sure is familiar to most people in the room, so she, I think it's 1939 or 1941, she has 2 big profiles. One in the Saturday Evening Post, about as middlebrow as you can get, right? And in the New Yorker, both the same year, and both are 2-issue profiles, not 1, but 2. How many of those have you seen? So that stopped me. Those are people who I would put in the book. And then sometimes there'd be a wonderful story, very much like one I had already told or one I hope to tell about a later decade. So those people are not in the book because the book is meant to be representative. It's not it's not a compendium like Ishbel Roth's book is. It meant to try to represent the experience of women as it happened over the decades.
You write, the subtitle of the book is How Women Changed American Journalism. How did women change American journalism?
In a number of ways. The most, unhappy way, I think, for the way it peg-posted women for a long time was the development of women's interest news. That meant that it was news men didn't want to write, so women got hired to do it. So it gave you entry, which was great, and probably this idea that maybe I'm going to catapult out of this, which happened rarely, if at all. And so it was good and bad in that it brought women in and brought revenue, because department store ads, elixir ads, perfume ads, all these things came with creating gossip and society and fashion and all these subjects, which is not to denigrate them at all, but to say that's important. In the 1880s, women pioneered investigative reporting. Ida Tarbell, Ida B. Wells, and Nellie Bly in her very personal, I was there, you can believe me way, without the documentation of the other two women. But that's a women's bastion to start. And then we have some movements that, were not so great, like the Stunt Girls, which is what Nellie did, and then the Sob Sisters, the Mary Sunshine character in Chicago. Those last little. They create opportunity for a moment, and then they fade away from overexposure and lack of sustained interest. So that happens. Those are places. Later on, we see, especially today, just to fast forward, most of the most interesting things that are happening in terms of benefits for the people who do the work have been pioneered by the nonprofits that are run by women. So I think that's another place where we see women's impact now in a way that's obviously very important.
In your preface, you write that, quote, trying to understand the chances women seized on and the impediments they overcame, I have at times used 21st century lens to reflect on the attitudes, impressions, and policies that stood unquestioned in their day. And you also write that later you say, quote, women journalists who accepted, if not embraced, a subservient role. Talk about that.
Well, no choice if you wanted to play. Remember, the options open to women, for the most part, were kind of drudgery to a large extent. So this was a field, even if you were doing something at the lowest levels, that was pretty exciting to be involved with. I don't know how many of you would have said, this is work I would have paid to do, but I've said that a few times. And I think that's not true of other professions that were available. So the interest to be part of this important, vital field made people accept compromises that you might otherwise have with the hope that things would change. And I want to step back just a minute to say that a woman who was A++ never had a problem in this field going back to Margaret Fuller in 1840. They never had an issue, never. They always, as my mother would have said, cream rose, always. That was never a problem. It was the A women who were on a par with the B- guys. That's where the problems came, that they could not catapult in the same way. And that's where a lot of the disaffection and unhappiness would come. Not to mention the sexism and other things that people, of course, had to overcome.
I got the impression through the book that you alluded to women embracing or accepting and embracing the role that was assigned to them, the stereotypes.
So think back. The idea of woman as mother, wife, homemaker, these are entrenched ideas that precede women coming to work, like work outside the home, by 300, 500, 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. So overcoming that, it becomes part of how you think. There was a lot of feeling in 1840, 1850, 1860 that women were incapable of critical thought, that the brain limitations were a congenital defect of womanness. This prevailed. So, often we internalize what's being said about us. Then you'd have situations like in the 1920s when someone like Ishbel Ross is, riding high because she is a man's idea of what a newspaper woman should be, there, which is a quote. You have other women who are sitting on the desks, showing their legs, making time with the copy editor, asking too much help from their male colleagues, creating a reputation that then pervades the whole group and that women are constantly fighting against. So those things happened.
You also write that you were focusing on the women who would do
Men's
what
work.
men's
Yes.
work and
Yeah.
what men
I need to say
wish
that.
they could do.
Not wish to, but would envy. It
Right.
would be like they're in jobs. Those are the only women that are in this book, which isn't to say anything else about other women, but they're women who are doing jobs men would have been happy to do or would have preferred to be doing. So those are the women the book is about. It's women who were able to succeed when for 130 years of this period, of 140 years maybe, that was not an easy thing to accomplish. So that's what I really wanted to point out.
And you bring it up and you say things only changed around the 1970s. I mean, in a permanent way.
1990s, really. I mean, we see the change in 70s when,
Talk about that.
well, God bless Vietnam. I have to say that was really helpful. A lot of us got hired then when men went to war, which had also happened in World War I and it happened in World War II. These were points where women came into the field, many to leave, either to marry or because they really weren't that good at it, but had been summoned because woman power was needed. That certainly happened. And then by the 70s, the women didn't go away. I mean, we really did have permanent positions that then, because of all the legislation of the 60s, there was actually equal opportunity legislation to help change things. So that happened. And women then started to really find place. And then by, 10 years of legal suits and other things, women finally come more to the fore, to a point where women represent about 40 or 45% of the field now, I think. And in leadership, not that high, but certainly much higher than ever before. Which, also reflects the strains of the industry, because you see throughout the book, women get opportunity when things are falling apart. That also happens.
How does that happen today?
It happens where, if you're in an organization like the one we worked for, where, Gene Balaby, our vice president, would say openly that he was happy to be Phil Spitalny in its all-girl orchestra, which we were in Europe. Every bureau chief, I think almost all of them were women, and I was the chief editor after I left Tel Aviv in a company that was, in free fall. It was falling apart. And he would say, we could get better talent by hiring women for what we could pay. So as early as 1930, at one of the small New York, mass circulation, but smaller New York papers, they make, the New York Graphic, they make a woman city editor. Yeah, in 1931, that had happened, and a year later, the paper's gone. Marvell Cook, the first black woman to be on a Metropolitan Daily in the 1950, that paper's gone a year and a half later. That is a pattern.
So what does it mean today if you have a lot of women rising up to...
Answer your own question.
Now, you also make a point that there's a convergence between race and, if you will, sex. And how does that interplay with women journalists?
The story I love to tell is what happened in the earliest period. So besides Margaret Fuller, who did everything in journalism anyone would ever want to do, and had done it by the age of 40, and then drowns in a shipwreck, off Fire Island at 40 years old. But she had already covered the underbelly of New York. She had gone to Europe and covered the Italian Revolution. She really is phenomenal. Alongside her are Lydia Maria Child, some people say Mariah, Knopf preferred Maria, so I'll go with that, And then the two women who follow her, Grace Greenwood and Gail Hamilton. And I'm sure none of you have heard of any of them unless you've read the book. And I was going to skip the 1860s and 1870s because I thought, oh, who cares about that period? These women are so remarkable, I couldn't do that. And the way they made their way was first Lydia. She has a husband who's kind of a ne'er-do-well journalist, lawyer and journalist. And they start the Massachusetts Journal. It fails really quickly. And she's doing Juvenile Miscellany, which is the first children's magazine in the country, like to make ends meet. But in the meantime, she's a very well-known woman writer of books. She writes practical books about cooking, about childcare, about a woman's place. She also writes biographies of major figures. Then David, the husband, gets offered to run the the Abolition Standard. I'm sure I've got that name wrong. And he turns it down, and she takes the job and runs this abolition paper. Well, this gives her the opportunity to write about other topics. And it's on a shoestring. She also starts this New York column that's very popular that she turns into books. And from writing for the Abolition Journal, everybody is reading your work, not just the girls, because everyone's reading those journals. Of course they are. So that's how she launches herself. Then she writes this screed about the place of the Americans called Africans that loses her entire audience, gets her blackballed for a decade. But then she recoups again and has an incredible career. In the next round, the 1860s, Grace Greenwood and Gail Hamilton go to work for Gamaliel Bailey's paper in Washington, also an abolition journal, where they get the same opportunity. And why are these men hiring them? Because they don't have any money to pay. So the women are getting platform that everybody is reading, and that changes everything. Gail Hamilton has a long and illustrious career at The Atlantic, which was, major in that day. And Grace Greenwood writes for the Times and other, major newspapers for the rest of her career, both from Washington as columnists and commenters and such as that. So that's one way I first saw the intersection, was that how they use that to move ahead. And then later on, we see things like Charlene Hunter Galt, who gets the Times to stop using Negro and use the word black. She opens what is the first hyperlocal bureau ever in Harlem, in the St. Teresa Hotel, across from the hotel in a law office, which she does for like 8 or 9 years. And, so there's a lot of pioneering that goes with this that cuts both ways. Those are just a couple examples. Yeah.
Do you feel that the book, is this the book that you wanted to write? It's 500 and something pages.
No, it's 389
yes, with
pages.
140 pages of endnotes.
So the endnotes are the 70,000 words I cut that I relegated to the back because I just couldn't give up the material, and it was sometimes a little secondary, but really good. So the book had to be a readable length, even though it looks like a doorstop. It's not. It's really not. It's short. 389 pages for 180 years. That's pretty good. Is it the book I wanted to write? So I think a lot of books that are coming out now, read the introductions, because COVID is a huge piece of them. It changes the way you had to work. So lots of things I did, translocated, just had to be. Librarians were just heroic in sending material, when they wouldn't have been sending as much as they sent because there was absolutely nothing else to do. And that was critically important and changed the way it was done. I started writing a year ahead of when I might have started. And I know other people who've done that. It's like, I can't go anywhere, I might as well write. Many of the interviews were not conducted in person because people were afraid. And so I think those are the things that I would say were constricting in certain ways. But then I spent a year longer writing, so maybe that wasn't so bad. I had the material. And I had, done something really crazy. I just bought every book. I must have bought 1,000 books. Like for $4 here. Used books, whatever, but I just bought everything. And then COVID happened. And I had all the material. I didn't have to go running around. I had it. And what I didn't have, I kept buying. So that really helped me. So is it more or less, yeah.
You quote Dorothy Thompson as saying that she denounced any talk of women's firsts as a disservice, an anachronism,
Yes.
and nothing more than specious feminism of women's magazines.
Yes.
Women's pages being nearly the only entry for women, but decried how they consumed the talents of women. Do you...
That remains true. That's why I quoted that, because I thought it was so true. I get really annoyed, inappropriately, I think, but I get annoyed every time an obit says trailblazer, and I'm thinking, you're no trailblazer. This was blazed 100 years ago. What are you talking about? And then I realized, checking myself, I've said this several times, but it needs to be said because I'm bad, that it so long has felt like you're a trailblazer, even though you're probably clearing underbrush and overgrowth. It felt that way to you, and it felt that way to everyone around you. So it's not so inappropriate that people would say it, but I hate the fact that it negates the history. So that's what bothers me about trailblazer. When you see it, you'll now not be able to look at it.
Did you experience sexual discrimination?
No. I mean, I was lucky. Did I have some episodes that were crappy? Yeah. And I think every woman will tell you a story or two. Yes.
You want to share yours?
Well, when I left Tel Aviv, the ambassador, I was the only woman in the press corps in Tel Aviv, made a very nice whatever, saying I was leaving, and said, and we're just really going to miss Brooke's legs. I mean, really? I'd been there for 4 years, Sabra and Shatila, the end of the Camp David Accords, war in Lebanon. I mean, it was a really busy time.
The bombing of the Iraqi reactor?
Well, that was a big one for us, Mel, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
That was a big one,
Yeah.
yes. So, I mean, it was like a very busy time, and it was like, I said, that's what he had. So that would be indicative of the kinds of things, or there was that guy at the Army press office who every
There were a
time
lot
I
of
called, we had to
guys.
call every day, and he would say, "So, Brooke, when are we going for coffee?" Every day, to a point where you had to make that call.
Yes.
Because, but is that terrible? I mean, in our day, we just kind of ate those things and let it go. I don't think that would happen today, but that is what we did.
Yeah, you commented in another appearance to a younger audience. You asked the students, can you imagine yourselves putting up with these types of comments and microaggressions? And as the father of 3 daughters, I can assure you that my kids won't.
Yeah. Well, we ate them. We just ate it. In this room, am I alone? No. So, but nothing really worse than that. I had opportunity because I worked for a failing company. I'm sure that was part of it, a lot of opportunity. And that's why I stayed so long until I went to Newsday. And any issues I had at Newsday were not about that. Not at all.
Okay, I think I'll open it up. Do we have any questions,
Should we
please?
pass this around, or
No,
is there
Tony
someone
has a
doing it?
question.
Okay. Oh, Tony, bless him. Thank you for listening.
You haven't talked about discrepancy in pay, which is something I am very conscious of and have
Age, did you say?
knowledge about.
In what?
Salary, pay. I would
Oh,
like to-
salary. So
Yes.
this is very interesting about salary. There was no discrepancy in salary until the 1880s. For the first 40 years, it was completely neutralized, not an issue, until women started to come into the field in greater numbers. And I don't know this for a fact, but just from having spent a lot of time in this subject area, the women come along, they're doing work that's devalued, mostly. They're on these women's pages that are important and that men really don't want to do, so they need them. And even at that, it's more interesting than other things that are available to women. So the understanding emerges that they can get women a lot cheaper and they're going to work for it and not going to complain, or complain quietly but do nothing about it. And then up until, gosh, I think the 70s, maybe till certainly through the 60s, there was an understanding that young men would need to support a family. And therefore, it made sense to pay them more. And that was accepted as, Torah from Sinai. I mean, it was just accepted. And that doesn't change for a really long time, even though all along there are divorced women, there are women taking care of their parents, there are women in all kinds of situations where they are supporting others, and that somehow does not get considered. But in the early days, it was kind of shocking to see that was a non-issue till about 1880, for 40 years.
You mentioned the 1990s as an inflection
Where's this coming
point.
from? Oh, there you are.
Sorry,
Hi.
over here. You mentioned the 1990s as an inflection point for women
I
in
think so.
journalism. What role did, if any, did university schools of journalism play in that?
So really by the 80s, journalism schools were full of women. And I think, I'm making this up, but I think this is true, that in law, in accounting, in psychology, in journalism, women fill the schools, and then when it comes to the field, they are not advancing generally proportionate to their numbers. Like it just isn't. Though, in awards, you can really see a change. I'll tell you how I know this, because at NYU we did 3 compilations. The whole faculty, the whole journalism faculty, plus eminent journalists from across media, like 20 other people. And we did the 100 best stories of the 20th century. And of those 100, 16 of them are the work of women, which if you consider that until the 1880s or 1890s, women are not taken enormously seriously, that's a pretty remarkable number, right? We did it again from 2000 to 2009. And in that period, 4 of the 10 we did 10. 4 of the 10 are by women, and that's commensurate to the 40% in the field, so that's pretty interesting and a big change. And then for 2010 to 2019, 7 of the 10 are by women, and 4 of those are women of color. So for me, that's, it's doing those kinds of little charts that kind of gives you this feeling of what the change has felt like.
Over here, Brooke.
Hi. Hi,
Hi,
Paul.
Brooke. In doing some research on the early 20th century and going through the New York papers pretty closely,
Welcome to my club.
Yeah, right, I know. First of all, very few writers got bylines in those days, and I'm wondering, as a matter of how you researched,
Yeah, so
how
it's
you
not
kinda-
true. Not true. They
Yeah.
all have bylines. All these women have bylines.
Well, that's
Yeah.
was the second part of this, was I did notice a number of women were getting bylines, often on very well-done feature stories, not women's page things, but, off the news feature stories. And it seemed to me that
'Cause they were a draw.
They were kind of stars
They were a
in
draw.
a way. This is the teens and the 20s say.
But, the men get bylines too, even
Yeah.
back in the 1880s and 1890s. They
Where-
do. It's just the front section is unsigned in a lot of papers. So
And-
it's that front section where there is no signing. Then all the other subsequent sections do have signatures.
What I'm wondering, and I haven't read your book yet, is I know. What I'm wondering is whether women were making a major contribution to feature writing, which was kind of like
I
being
didn't mention
created.
that.
You
That's
did?
2 other areas where women had real impact. Thank you for saying that. One is feature writing, which they seem to have skill for. And the interview as a journalistic form was really pioneered by women, I would say. I mean, they were very good at it and doing it very early. Like by the 1880s, we saw women doing important interviews. Some that still are seminal, like Nellie Bly's interview with Susan B. Anthony, of Emma Goldman at the Tombs. I mean, these are really important pieces that are still studied. Thank you for that. I'd forgotten to mention it. There's so much
Okay,
in there.
a question.
There's so much. What? Yeah. Hi.
How accurate is My Girl Friday?
I don't know. I think it's, if you read Stanley Walker's City Editor, where he talks about, the gallery of angels, and he just says every indictment against women in journalism, a lot of those tropes are picked up in that piece. So it's, it's caricature, but helter-skelter, wild times,
Here.
Hi.
Did you detect any change over the decades about how women work with each other? Do they help each other more at any particular time?
Oh, so in the book, I do something in World War II where there's, World War II, women were banned from going to the front. Like you could get to Europe and about 10% of the field was women, just like in World War I, both times 10%. But most of the women, first of all, weren't trained to go to battle. I mean, they were coming without even city room, city desk experience. So, I'm not so sympathetic to the fact they didn't get to go to the front, but there was a coterie that did, including Martha Gellhorn and Ann Stringer of UPI and Inez, what's her name, from the Boston Globe, and there was a group who could, and they're going up the Rhine and covering the link up at Targau. They're doing everything, and the military kind of turned a blind eye to them, but they often would get in spats. And in those cases, those women, though they kept their own counsel and kept their own scoops, would band together to form a united front to get privileges that they needed. Being able to file, latrines, all kinds of things that were not provided. And still did, some of them, really remarkable work. Most of the women in the war situations would be doing civilian features or, how the soldiers are living, how they're coping, things that would appeal to mothers, sisters, lovers, wives back home.
Here.
Brooke, did the men reporters write about those subjects as well?
About soft subjects?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, Ernie Pyle,
Yes.
very much did that kind of work. I think he's most famous for that kind of work. So yes, some men did, but these kinds of things fell to women. They would fall to women because they're not covering the battlefield, which was the important thing to be doing, or the diplomatic moves, which are the most important things to do. Those are the men's jobs. So we have women who do that. Anne O'Hare McCormick, Dorothy Thompson, others who really could. Anne O'Hare McCormick discovered Mussolini and was a stringer for the Times for 14 years. They would not hire her until Adolph Ox died. And then Arthur Hayes comes in, and he's, this is what I didn't mention. These women in this book are all phenomenal networkers, phenomenal. Like from the beginning, they know the friendships to make, they cultivate them. Anne O'Hare McCormick was a great friend of Iphigene and Arthur Hayes. She and her husband, they were social friends. So, but she also was a remarkable reporter who Adolph Ox would not have on staff. So as soon as he dies and Arthur Hayes takes over, she's hired, she gets a column on the op-ed page and the first woman's seat on the editorial board. 14 years after working for the paper, which, Mussolini is 1921, so we're at 1936 now. 1937, she wins the Pulitzer Prize. That's fantastic. And I think, oh, this is great, right? So I read the Times story, which is kind of a set piece story every year. It's on the front page. The big headline is always the book or the play that has taken the prize, and the second line always is whoever won from the Times in smaller type. Like that's the formula. And in Anne O'Hare McCormick's year, it's not in the headline. And I'm reading on, and finally the penultimate paragraph before the jump notes that a woman has won. And I'm thinking, this is kind of news. It's the first woman journalist to win a Pulitzer Prize. Like, even for another paper, it's news. Like, why is this being treated in this, really reduced fashion? It was just so strange. And, on, and then inside it's the usual format. And then I look back 5 years to see what's happened, and whenever Arthur Kroc wins, it's right up there. He's her competition, for Foreign and Washington, always in the headline, not Anne. And so then I go through the Pulitzer files, and the ones that are available, kind of openly listed, indexed at Columbia, there's kind of nothing for 1936, which is weird. So I went to the Pulitzer Foundation to see if they had more material, and the mystery was solved. The Times didn't nominate her. She was acclaimed by the Columbia faculty, who were the judges that year, with no packet, no letter of recommendation, not even her own. You could recommend yourself, I suppose, with nothing. They simply opened their, big volumes of Times and looked at the stories and gave it to her, and the jury did that, and then the board affirmed it. And the way I could figure that out was they wanted to do an exhibition, and they were looking for the packet, within the Pulitzer operation. And so the answer came back, there is no packet. This was done by the faculty. And then it, P.S., takes another 14 years for a woman to win, and that's Maggie Higgins, who wins for Korea. And that was interesting, too. 14 years later, 1951, 6 people won that year. 2 Chicago Times or Chicago Daily News, I'm not sure which, 2 AP, and 2 Herald Trib, Maggie and Homer Biggert, while he was still at the Herald Trib. And if you read the citations, you can go on the Pulitzer site and read them for yourself. The men's are, great reporting, da-da-da, and hers is kind of, and special consideration because she was a woman. She was the riskiest, most, forward of anybody reporting from Korea, 300 men and her. So, it's a little like that.
Brooke,
Yes.
I don't know whether I speak for most authors, but whenever I'm working on a project, I inevitably find someone who's been completely forgotten, and it becomes sort of a cause for me to resurrect this person and commemorate this person and rescue this person from obscurity. And I'm wondering whether you found any reporters in your research who've been forgotten and whose work blew you away and whom you champion in your book.
There's a couple, some of whom are well known, but maybe their whole story isn't known, like Charlene Hunter Gault, who I got very excited about. But I would say Ann Stringer, who was this UPI reporter. And of course, wire service reporters are going to be forgotten. Half the time, their names aren't even on their work. So of course they're going to be forgotten. And the exciting thing that's happened is that it's being, that 2,000-word excerpt of her career is being published in letterpress as a chapbook by Thornwillow Press. So I'm they just asked if they could do it, and I thought, yeah, you could do that. And it's Thornwillow Press, and it's a little chapter book. It comes in 3 they do gorgeous engraved stuff.
But who is it about?
Ann Stringer, who you'll never have heard of, but you will never forget after you read her story.
Stringer or Springer?
Stringer. Yeah, interesting name for a full-time reporter. Yeah. No. Yes, Joe.
Brooke, I'd love to hear your thoughts about whether women bring qualities to journalism that men can't quite match.
I don't think so. I think, no. I think, no. I think individuals bring qualities to journalism that are important. And I just don't think it's gender related. We see compassion, we see all sorts of things from all kinds of people. I really don't feel that way. Yes, hi.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to ask if you, thanks. Is this on? What kind of impact do you think all the women's suits, lawsuits had? Not suits. Yeah. I was part of 2 of them, one at the Washington Post and then at Newsday. Just in, not.
So are you part of that alumni group at the Washington Post?
I left the Washington Post before.
No, but there's like a group, there's a wonderful alumni group who, oh, okay, I just wondered. I know them. I know that because I worked there too. So the question was, what was the question? Oh, the lawsuits. So the lawsuits had, they're like an important blip. They follow the feminine mystique, the legislation. It took women quite a few years, like 6 or 7 years, to realize that the civil rights legislation applied to them and could be used as an instrument in their own efforts to gain equity. I mean, it was like, when we go back to talking about congenital defects and the feelings women have about themselves, they didn't even figure that out for a long time, that they could use it. So once they did, they organized. I think there was, it certainly caused a lot of consternation, and so consternation can cause change. But the progress after that is very, very slow. I mean, it's not like suddenly everything opened up and changed. It just didn't. But were they important? Absolutely. Protest is important.
Hey, Brooke, thank you for everything you had to say today and for the book.
Thank you.
You're in the best position to answer this question, I think, and that is, all of the women in this room have certainly put up with misogyny, and as you say, we just ate it. We just
ate it.
took it, right? And all of us are furious still, I think. But I'm wondering if you would put a mark in the long chart. Where do you think we are in terms of real equal opportunity?
I think we're there. I think we're there. I think the problem is the industry is in complete tumult. Yeah, I think that we can see that change. I really think we can. Don't you? Well, say more.
No, I don't see equal opportunity. I still see women characterized by how they look, and hired because of the certain way they look. Maybe it's because I'm in broadcast.
Maybe it's broadcast.
Yeah, but I think it still plays well. If you're young and pretty, it helps. No matter what the opportunity should be, that is an unfortunate qualification.
So that may be more broadcast related. There's a funny sequence in the book that I pulled from a women's magazine where, remember Christine Kraft? And, Too Old, Too Ugly, and Not Deferential Enough to Men. I think that was the title of her book. And has this, she's an anchor in Kansas City, and they demote her for these reasons. And this causes ripples throughout the industry. And so Leslie Stahl, Connie Chung, Lynn Scher, a whole bunch of them who are now in their late 30s at the time, are, freaking out about this. And Leslie Stahl says something like, I'm paraphrasing, I'm at my prime. I have a long way to go. And I think, well, she did. So I think there are some women who've been able to move over that. Andrea Mitchell, others have been able to keep that going. And you can count them, yeah.
This is a little off subject, but Gannett News Service, and you may have heard about it.
Oh, I write about the Des Moines
totally
Register.
Dropped the Associated Press.
Yeah, we heard that yesterday.
It's a friend of mine, David Endelman, who was one of our Silurians, says this is a disaster. It's a disaster for women, for everybody who contributes to the AP. Your comments?
Well, I know Gannett hired lots of women and promoted lots of women very early. Yeah, I think it's scary, don't you? It speaks to the quality of what's going on in the news world. So
We have time for about one or two more questions.
it's so fun to talk to a room of journalists, and the questions are great, and I appreciate that so much.
Thanks, Tony. Brooke, I just want to say Jonathan Siegel obviously chose the right author to write this book.
You think?
And I don't know who's handling at your publisher, sales and distribution. I know nothing about that world. But I hope your book is being offered to not just the syllabus on, in college journalism classes, but also in the high school world, because I think your book really needs to be there.
Tell them. Okay.
Thank you for the question, Fran.
One more?
Thank you. Oh, you're going to hold it, okay. Well, I would like to say something in defense of the old women's news departments.
Please do.
Because I think we used to do things that aren't being done anymore. I worked in the style department of the Times for many years, and we would do the stories that nobody else wanted. The ERA, equal pay, abortion rights, all of this. the rest of the paper was not interested, but they let us do whatever we wanted.
So what, can I ask what years that was?
Oh, this was in the 60s.
Did you work for Charlotte Curtis?
Yes, this was
Cool.
under the great Charlotte Curtis.
So, okay, so she is in the book. She's the exception in the book because she turned that into a power nexus, and I thought that was important to recognize, and also set the standard for style sections across the country. So I do give her her due.
Well, maybe she was unique, but that gave us a place to do all
Yeah.
kinds of things that
So-
the rest of the paper was not interested in.
Interestingly, in the 1940s, John Darnton's mother was women's editor for 2 years at the Times. As a young widow with 2 young boys, she started in Washington. She'd asked for a job, and then they brought her to New York as women's editor. And she made this argument that these pieces needed to be throughout the paper and that they would not do it. And she quit over the fact that she could not move any of her fellow editors on that subject. Just a little tidbit.
Brooke, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Fascinating.
Thank you.